The Spin-Off Podcast Network. Ready to rediscover the joys of cycling? With over 300 kilometres of cycle paths across Tāmaki Makaurau, jumping on your bike and going for a ride is such a fun way to discover the city from a different perspective. Cycling is getting more and more popular across Auckland, so now's a great time to join the hype and give cycling a go. Head to at.govt/cycling to find your nearest cycleway today.
The Fold is brought to you by O Media, making brands unmissable and public spaces better across Aotearoa. No mai hoki mai kia The Fold e mihi nei ko Duncan Gree tōku ingoa. My guest this week is Don Mann, who is CEO of the Pacific Media Network. He is also someone who I reckon has got the most rich and varied CV of anyone I've had on this podcast. He's a rugby league lifer from a big rugby league whānau. He had a big commercial role at the Warriors for 13 years. Prior to that, he was a constable and then a detective for the police for 15 years. And then latterly worked at Aotearoa in commercial. So a very long and textured CV, but not one that sort of screamed media. And yet, to hear him tell it, all of his roles, he had a job to do that was to serve his community, and we sort of get into how you do that in these different roles to an extent. But for the most part, I met Don around a year ago, and he'd been in the job for about a year then. So he's one of these. There's a whole generation of CEOs who sort of started in the early part of 2020 who've only ever known the pandemic era as leaders, and I think that they should have a support group because it's a real thing that they've been through, and they don't know anything else. So. And obviously for the Pacific Media Network, which is basically it's a radio broadcaster. It has two core stations, 531 PI and New FM, and it has to broadcast in 11 languages, has to entertain, inform, create culture. It has so many complex and varied roles to fill, and the doing of those roles at any time is difficult. To do it during a pandemic, particularly during a pandemic, which has had an undue and disproportionate impact on the Pacific community, particularly in South Auckland, where the Pacific Media Network is based. And the big thing, and we touched on this at the start, is that the Pacific Media Network, which is funded through a mix of government, direct funding to achieve a particular mandate, and then commercial revenue, really actually epitomizes what the merged RNZ TVNZ entity is trying to do at vastly bigger scale. So there are lessons there. There are also dangers there, because this entity will necessarily be trying to serve every single audience, including the ones that the Pacific Media Network is trying and succeeding to serve itself already. So we talk a bit about how the shape of that entity and how it interacts with smaller organisations like ours and like his will be crucial to sort of finding out what impact it will have, the good and the bad, on the whole of the New Zealand media. So, Don's just an amazing person, and I think this is a really fun conversation. So, enjoy. Tēnā koe, male ilele, and welcome to The Fold, Don Mann.
Kia ora Duncan, malolile. Great to be here.
So it's a year since we first met, I think about, and almost 2 years since you flung yourself into this strange industry. How are you finding it?
Oh, it's fascinating. Change, disruptive, never a dull moment, amplified by COVID, of course. I love every minute of it.
So tell me about the Pacific Media Network, what its remit is, the communities it serves, and how it does its work, I guess.
Yeah, sure. A national broadcaster based in Manukau, but serving the Pacific population of Aotearoa. So, just under 400,000 people. broadcast in 10 languages, 30 years old next year, part public funded, part commercial revenue. With responsibilities back to the Minister of Broadcasting and the Minister for Pacific Peoples.
So, I mean, just touching on that, like you can kind of sense some of the complexities and the tensions of it, right? Like, because, on some level, this is a mini version of what they're trying to build with the merged entity, a bit of a mixed private-public funding model. You're trying to serve a hugely diverse group of people. I mean, all of the languages that you have to try and serve those communities is super difficult. There's a very finite pool of putia.
Yep, that's a really interesting point. And as the business case was set for the new public media entity, I sort of chuckled with my chair at the time, Peter Farfiu, that the new public media entity sounds a lot like us, publicly funded, part commercial revenue, audience-centric, and executing in a way that meets underserved audiences. So for us, it's by multiple languages.
So, I want to talk quite extensively about the merger and how that's going to interact with you later on. But do you? Because I think there's a really interesting challenge for basically any media organisation that existed prior to the internet effectively, and that it must continue to serve those core audiences. Like, some of its biggest assets and work streams remain, the sort of quote unquote legacy media forms, and yet, Pacific audiences are, the average age of a Pacific person in New Zealand is 24. Therefore, they're going to be the first generations, the first communities to often to adapt to and adopt new behaviours. How do you internally resolve that? And do you feel like, given the mandate that you have, that you've been adequately resourced to kind of serve those kind of two quite differing communities, the younger
great.
And the older audiences?
Yeah, great point. Look, our mandate is to uphold Pacific culture, language, identity. You mentioned, the legacy media entities. We're in essence a radio broadcaster. We were founded on radio. And our trust deed actually specifically talks about delivering radio broadcast services, and it still says that.
And that's quite limited. So you have to almost go beyond your trust deed to meet the demands of the moment.
Absolutely. So we're probably like a lot of larger media entities, perhaps in the last 5 years, that we're a legacy radio. We have to move towards multimedia and digital. But we've got these responsibilities that are enshrined in our trust deed, and we're also got responsibilities under the Public Finance Act and Crown Entities Act to deliver certain outputs which revolve around radio. But as you mentioned, the average age Pacific is just under 24, over 30% of the Pacific population under 15. So if we stay in radio land, we won't be here in 5 years.
And so how do you resolve that? Because it does feel like there's a tension there that is almost impossible, right? Like you can't. The radio is a notoriously relatively cheap medium to create, and yet there is a minimum cost to it. You can, and there are sort of some synergies you can create, whether it's redeploying studios to do other things, but fundamentally, to keep those things running doesn't leave, and it's not like your organisation, I looked at some annual reports, it's not like it's vastly well funded by comparison to some other public media entities. So how do you go about serving those, like 30% under 15 is just a phenomenal volume of people.
Yeah. Look, and for the record, it's on public record. Our public funding is about 4.7 million, and we have about an additional 2 million in commercial revenue. So around about a 70-30, 80-20 split.
Yeah.
And that funding just really allows us to employ people to broadcast by radio, and it's actually 11 languages, 10 languages in English, and we can't do much more. So at this kind of point in time, we do have an over-reliance on broadcasting through third-party platforms like Facebook. We're kind of bound into that model. So, I mean, it's a big challenge for us, and I guess for us, when I look at, I know we'll talk about it later, but when I look at even RNZ prior to the public media entity, and now thinking about the public media entity, there are obvious opportunities for an organisation like PMN to grow, to share infrastructure, places, people, as the new public media entities formed. Because, RNZ, TVNZ, publicly funded, we're publicly funded. It seems pointless to duplicate some of the big infrastructure services.
So, and we'll dig into that soon, but it's hard because all roads lead to the merger, I think, in any aspect of public media at the moment. I want to talk a bit about you first because, as I was saying before we got on air, I think you've got the most varied CV of anyone who's ever come on this podcast. And, media is a strange beast of an industry. So it's all I've ever known, but I know what it is, I think. What drew you to move across from the various spheres you've operated in and take up this job?
I've basically had 4 roles in my career. I was a policeman. I was the general manager of the commercial of the Warriors. I did some time in economic development for Aotearoa, for Auckland Council, and here. They all seem quite different, but at the end of the day, when I sort of think back and look at it, it's all really about serving people. I know that sounds a bit idealistic, but for me, I always found meaning in trying to make a difference for sort of the communities that I feel I'm part of. A migrant father. My father's Tongan, came here just after World War II. I'm a Māori mother, so whakapapa to Ngāti Kahanunu and Tūhoi, but urban Māori in all respects. So I've just tried to use the roles and the positions I've had to serve back to my communities or make a difference for sort of younger people coming through. And that's kind of how I rationalise it. I don't see too many difference between the roles myself. I often joked when I sort of moved from the Warriors not long after the 211 grand final to the city, and I sort of joke I went from selling tickets to Mount Smart to selling Auckland City. It's the same concept, and I rationalised the police was really it's crime and it's law and order and it's compliance, but it's really about trying to make a difference in people's lives. And the Warriors was that too. So it's easy to reconcile all those things. I do them all in 13-year blocks. So maybe I'll get restless after 10 years. That's
a good long road ahead of you still, which I think I'm sure the network would be grateful for. So the thing that's interesting to me about all those 3 roles that you describe is that they're relatively public organisations, or very public in police and Warriors. So, and they can often have quite complex relationships with media. Since you've kind of gone to the other side, if you will, do you feel like there are things that you understand about the way that media related to those organisations that sort of feel different, or things that you think media could learn from, having, from the perspective that you had looking at it from there?
Yeah, I've always, I was an accidental policeman. Left school, parents said, go get a job. It was Army, Navy, Air Force, Police. Police came back first. I was in the police. So there was no great calling or anything like that. So I've always been kind of maybe even at a young age, relatively socially aware. It's down to sort of the friends I grew up with and I knocked around with. So even though whilst I was in the police, I always had an interest in how things were being portrayed or looking at the system or how politics work. I marched in the Springbok tour. I was 16 and just on the road outside here, took part in that march. I was 7th former at Kelston Boys High. At the age of 13, I stood on Bastion Point. So even though I sort of had a police background and these sort of big public roles, that kind of awareness of what's going around me, I sort of always had. And so I've always had an interest in media, always. And it's kind of ironic that I'm in the media now. And even... I can remember back, even looking at television and looking for people that looked like my mother or my father on television. I was speaking to some of the some journalism cadets the other day, and they asked me a question about, why is the journalism cadetship program important as a te rito one? And I said to them, well, When I was young, my hero was Muhammad Ali because I couldn't see anyone on television that looked like my father or me. And so I hung on to an African-American man who probably didn't have much in common, but now it's so much different.
So I was going to say that because you would have, because you've had a rich and full life, you will have seen the way that media interacts with your communities evolve over time. And while I think there is a very justifiable critique of the fact that our newsrooms and our media still lacks a true representation of the various communities that make up Aotearoa, to my mind, it has changed and changed relatively palpably over the last 10 years. Do you sort of see that as well, or like what's your sense of how this industry's changed?
Yeah, absolutely changed, and the work that beyond the formation of iwi radio, PMN of course, Māori television, even the work that Carmen Parahi's doing at Stuff with Sinead Boucher, and even I've seen some of the work organisation like yourself have been doing, but. It's come about recently, but even, I was sort of thinking, it's interesting, not so long ago there was a Rugby League World Cup. I use Rugby League as an example because it's an area I know. And the Tongan Rugby League team played the Kiwis in Auckland. And it was interesting, I was watching how media portrayed that event and how the council portrayed that event. So if you were to read, say, I was using New Zealand Herald, for example, it was reported there was this mass disruption and disorder in Otahuhu. But from a Pacific perspective, when I looked at that as a Tongan person, when I looked at that, I saw celebration, I saw joy, I saw people expressing their identity, but it was reported as mass disorder. So that's from a media perspective, and that's not too long ago.
No, it's like 4 or 5 years.
Yeah,
right?
And then from a city council perspective, and I was inside council at the time, the Tongan population were viewed not as ratepayers or residents. So whilst it was an international game involving New Zealand and the nation of Tonga, the 30,000 people that were at the stadium were Auckland ratepayers and residents. So there was no fan zone. There was no infrastructure. There was no crowd control mechanisms. There was no, fan zone like you see downtown. The organisation, the community was left to do their own thing. And so in two ways, from a council perspective and infrastructure perspective, the community was viewed as non-citizens. And from a media perspective of what I saw and what I consumed is that there was just a complete misunderstanding of what was actually happening. And so my point is, I guess in relation to what we're talking about today, is I could see these things even, 4 years before coming into a role like taking on PMN, and was acutely aware of that.
So you were at Aotearoa at that time? At that time,
yeah.
And part of Aotearoa's remit, at times is to kind of generate, the liaise with sporting events and so on and try and create some of that atmosphere around them. Why do you think the organisation sort of missed on that? I mean, in some ways, I relate to what you say, but not relate to, but I absolutely understand what you say. But there was the fact that it was so decentralised, because I remember the cars with Tongan flags kind of going around the city, and the energy that brought was actually unlike any kind of organised, commodified sporting event that you can think of. So, but the fundamental, the sort of injustice or the missed opportunity, depending on how you want to frame it, of that moment, that these organisations still seem to kind of, missing as recently as that, and are likely still to again, unless something kind of more fundamental changes.
Yeah, and I think it was just a simple disconnection. It was promoted as an international event to promote Auckland as a vibrant city, but there was a misreading that the people that were consuming it were Auckland residents and
like a home game as well, in a way.
Happened to be Tongan.
Yeah.
So there's just a disconnect there.
So, and you have, through Pacific Media Network, entered into a collaboration you referred to glancingly before, Te Rito, which feels very groundbreaking to me in that it takes Māori television, Pacific Media Network, News Hub, and the New Zealand Herald, and attempts to train like a sort of a super diverse bunch of cadets into this industry. Do you want to tell us how that which is funded by through the Public Interest Journalism Fund, tell us how that came about and how it's going?
Yeah, sure. Look, when the Public Interest Journalism Fund came out, we were looking at on how we can make most of the opportunity. We've got issues around scale. We're a small organisation, so it's not as simple for us to just take on a whole lot of new talent and try to do it properly. We
can relate.
We can't do that. So I had a phone call from Lois today, who was at NZME, and asked would we be interested in signing a letter of support to NZME's Te Rito application. I spoke to Lois and I said, well, no. There'll be no letter of support. If you want us to be involved, we're part of the partnership or not. We're not going to be an advisor. We're not going to be an add-on, and it won't be by way of letter of support. So I really take my hat off to NZME. Once I put that forward, NZME and NewSub both welcomed us in. The other caveat I had was we'll be in if Māori television are in. And so I sort of, it was important for us as a Pacific media entity to be alongside the tangata whenua media as well, so to be alongside Māori television. Yeah, and all three organisations, they're much larger organisations. They could have done it without us. They didn't need us. But they're very welcoming, and we're in there as an equal partner. We operate under a partnership agreement that gives us equal status alongside NZME and NewSub and Māori television. And that was important for us. I didn't want it to be a tick-boxing exercise for any of those organisations or for us. I wanted it to be meaningful for us at an organisation perspective from us. There's no future in us just been doing what we're doing in Manukau, being all internal about it and not collaborating. We don't have the resources to do it. So if we're going to make a difference and if we're going to be around here for another 30 years, we have to collaborate. We have to do it. We have to grow through these partnerships. Now there were some in the Pacific media community who advised me not to do it, and they thought, well, partners within the Pacific media community should be coming together and doing our own thing. But it's not that simple because, we're all scrapping over crumbs, and even bringing together, 3 or 4 of the Pacific media entities, we've all got our own challenges and it's hard for us to do it. And there's also the question of, by doing that, am I enabling somebody, an organisation like NZME or NewSub to move into our space? Look, at the end of the day, if there are more Pacific or Māori or diverse journalists coming through, we all win. It just can't be about what's good for us.
Yeah, and I think that tension between sort of building the islands, and everyone having their own patch and sort of looking out for that feels like the old world, and the new one is much more. Because to me, suddenly the new ocean is social media, and it's the infinite space of the internet itself. And so the only way we can ever acquire enough scale to kind of create great products and meaningfully convey sort of culture and information to a local audience is through collaborating in sort of small and large ways.
Otherwise, we'll just we'll be irrelevant.
The Fold is brought to you by O Media, making brands unmissable and public spaces better across Aotearoa, with over 4,000 out-of-home advertising sites nationwide across both street furniture and retail centres. I'm super grateful to O Media for enabling us to make unmissable connections with Kiwis.
Raising capital or taking your business to the world? Investment Fix has the lowdown on everything you need to make it happen. This season, we're exploring the US market, the opportunities it offers, what it takes to grow a business there, and the best way to approach investors. Join some of the superstars of the investment and business world as they share advice from their time in the US so you can make your mahi count in this massive market. The Investment Fix podcast, brought to you by Invest New Zealand. Tune in today.
Skinny are helping you show how smart you are with the 1Q quiz, an all-new, super challenging and super quick daily quiz built by the Spin-Off. Every Monday, Skinny are giving you the chance to prove you're smart with the Skinny Extra Credit question. Get it right, and you'll get the chance to score yourself some Skinny Extra mobile credit, so you can text, call, or even video call your group chat and gloat about how big your brain is. T's and C's apply.
So you've been here two years. Tell me what has surprised and impressed you about your organisation through that time, and particularly, obviously, that in its entirety, it's been conducted against a time of extreme stress.
Yeah, 2 years, 2 years in a pandemic. I think the main thing is the impact of PMN. Relatively small in terms of funding-wise, and serving a highly segmented community. But our impact is enormous. The government entities who are looking to communicate with the Pacific community through COVID all came through to us. And so we benefited from the pandemic in terms of government spend. And so we were able to sort of demonstrate, okay, well, the reason why 531 or why New FM or why PMN was set up 30 years ago actually rang true during COVID. That it was and we are a trusted conduit into the Pacific community. That was probably the standout, our impact. And it's interesting, there was a Tongan vaccination event in September last year in South Auckland. It was called Malu'i Mā Tonga, sort of Protect Tonga. And there was a survey done by the Tongan Health Society on those who came through and how did you find out about this? How did you hear about it? Well over 3/4 was via radio. The next largest amount, which was still significant, was word of mouth. And I know you've spoken to Samson Samasoni before, and he's contributes to your work. It talks about, back to your earlier point, yes, we have a young community. Yes, the path forward is in terms of digital consumption and technology and what have you. But there are still issues of equity and access into the Pacific community. And the community and radio is still important in times of need. And word of mouth amongst the community that it holds in high regard, sort of face-to-face interaction and collectivism is still important.
I mean, it only takes one in your whānau to be listening to radio, and then they can transmit it.
That's right.
I mean, it's interesting you say about the way that government used the PMN through that period, because there were periods of time when it was quite harshly criticised, often from, say, potentially like health providers within that community. The government was for the way that had reached out. Do you feel and the Pacific Media Network, with its sort of cultural, linguistic expertise and all the interconnection, was so well placed. Did government see you for what you could be from the start, or was that something that it sort of realised as it went through?
I think Ministry of Health realised as it went through. I think, in fairness to the government, there's a large Pacific caucus, large stepper. The individuals there knew the potential of PMN, but
it's the gap between them and the ministry.
And the ministry and the authorities, they took a while to come through. But once they did, it was fine. I mean, we have this public good part of our business, but we also have a newsroom, and it's not well known. We have a newsroom. We have a small newsroom. And so on one hand, we're executing government contracts, but on the other hand, we're running a newsroom where people such as Dr. Colin Tukui-Tonga and Debbie Sorensen from Pacific Media Medical Association, some of the harshest critics of Ministry of Health are criticising the government response on our news channel. Then on the other side of their business, we're promoting language. So, yeah, no, it took a while. If I perhaps take the listeners back to, there was a mass vaccination event in Manukau. It would have been around August last year.
I remember the one.
Yeah, it was designed by the Ministry of Health.
It wasn't
designed by the
particularly
community.
well attended.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah. Very small Pacific and Māori uptake. And so it was just, that was a kind of like a turning point so it's got an important marker in the vaccination process, because after that was kind of like a big kind of mass event. After that, that's when you started to see the ethnic-driven vaccination responses by the various communities. And then you really saw some traction. The Vaxathon event was the icing on the cake, but the Pacific communities had already heavily mobilised by that time.
Well, that to me sort of epitomises the difference between like a government seem to often try to kind of come top down and then expect people to do whatever it was they were asking, and Vaxathon seemed to epitomise in a lot of the way that the different Pacific communities ended up running. Yeah, the community up seems to be the a much more effective way to do it.
Yeah, I mean, Vaxathon worked at the end of the day because, Pacific people do love a competition, and the Tongans wanted to outdo the Samoans and the Cooks and the way, and so it worked in the end. Everyone loves a celebration. But, that when our medium was used, and other Pacific medium and Māori media, and when there were ethnic-driven responses, things really started to move. And despite a lot of the noise around last year about Māori vaccination rates, Pacific vaccination rates, but Pacific vaccination rates were
they're actually always good.
They're always good.
Yeah,
it was never an issue.
That's what Samson wrote very compellingly about for us.
It was never an issue. When I sort of think about sort of the comms in the early stages, and we have our Prime Minister, we had our health spokespeople, and lately it was Minister Hipkins and Dr. Bloomfield and others at the podium. But one of the things I felt was important was that the Pacific people could see themselves in who was speaking. So it's no disrespect meant to Prime Minister or Dr. Bloomfield, they did a good job in their communication. But there were no Pacific people on that podium. Every now and then, I think maybe once Minister Sepuloni might have got on the podium. Minister Seal might have had the opportunity to stand beside one of the ministers. So we embarked on a program with the Ministry of Health that I wanted to see our Pacific leaders in the health space being out and speaking to our community. Because whilst, the 1 o'clock briefings were fine, if Dr. Talimai Tonga or Dr. Tukui Tonga said exactly what Dr. Bloomfield said, those communities would listen.
So it feels like there is an opportunity here to sort of heed the hard-learned and in some ways tragically learned lessons of the communication within the pandemic at this inflection point where we are setting up a new public media entity that takes RNZ and TVNZ and makes it into a new one. And I think both of those organisations would say, and I think you could argue that they have made strides in diversifying all aspects of their business. I'm sure that they would also both acknowledge that there's more to do. How do you perceive the merger and how it might impact the Pacific Media Network and what you would like to see as your role into it? Because there is a huge ceiling basement between the best and worst case scenarios in terms of how it impacts an organisation like yours.
Yeah, first of all, I see opportunity for us. I see opportunity for Pacific Media Network. And I spoke about infrastructure before, about, thinking about our forward investment on digital infrastructure, platforms and what have you. Radio transmission infrastructure is incredibly expensive. So I think there's tremendous opportunity in shared infrastructure. It seems pointless to me that three publicly funded organisations would all be building their own infrastructure. So there's opportunities for us here. I think there's also a question of, and this can be resolved when the new board and the management come in, is if what's potentially PMN's role if we've got certain expertise in language and broadcasting in language. Is there an opportunity for PMN to take on that role on behalf of the new entity? Why set up perhaps another broadcasting language unit in the new entity when an organisation like ours could take up that role and work in partnership with the new entity? So there's those sort of things. And the obvious other ones are in sort of people development and training. PMN's largely over its time. In our trust deed and our founding document, we have this responsibility. It's written in one of the clauses there that we're responsible for developing a pipeline of Pacific broadcasters for Aotearoa. We're not the only ones, but it sits in our trust deed.
It's not a small thing. Just throw that in there.
Yeah. And we actually do that. We've done it over the years. If you look at, say, for instance, as an example, say someone like Susana Aotearoa at RNZ has come through Pacific Media Network at some stage, and there's many others that are through the broadcast area. People such as Tapu Misa have touched PMN at various times. So if we could really supercharge that responsibility, we could do it in partnership with a new public media entity.
Do you have a sense that, have you been kind of consulted through this, and do you have a sense that obviously there's so much that's unknown about it now, but that it's likely that it does have that posture towards you? Because the inverse is also true, that they decide, we've got to build it ourselves, and we're some people with language and expertise in broadcasting. Oh, cool, we'll go grab that.
Yeah. Look, we were consulted, and we had time with Tracy Martin, and we spent time with Tracy Martin and her group putting a submission in. MCH were very good. We had a couple of sessions with the MCH, and even we spent time talking direct to Minister Farfoy and his advisors. So feel very confident that our voice has been heard. There are issues such as, even using terms like underserved audiences. Well, of course we'd say, well, according to who?
Yeah, we do underserved by who?
By who, and according to who? We do that every day. So there's terms like that. And then when you look at the detail about, okay, we're going to set up this new entity will serve younger audiences and Māori and Pacific. We know what happened when there was that attempt a few years ago to set up a youth radio station at RNZ, and they've since launched Tahi. Well, we have in our armoury, we have New FM in our armoury, so there's already a vehicle or a mechanism there.
And so that's got history, it's got authenticity. You're not just trying to pull it out of the air.
20 years old in August, so there's an entity there. So we of course we would resist and challenge any action that would negatively impact on us or even potentially cause real risk to us and being able to survive. We'd push against that. But in saying that, I do see opportunity for the organisation. There's also we spoke before about the possible disconnect sometimes between political discourse and then action by ministries. It's all very well to have these nice statements about what this entity could mean. But you and I know what happens once we have people like ourselves, like you and I, take up their roles. We get competitive. We want to report on our KPIs.
We want to win.
Report back to and we want to win. Yeah. And then that's when it rubs up against what the purpose of the entity is for.
And that's where I think a structure of it that doesn't try and make it all itself, but where it has a desire to serve a particular audience or create something, it goes to the people with expertise and says, hey, do you want to work together on this?
Yeah. And I must mention Paul Thompson, actually. Since I started 2 years ago, from the moment I started, Paul has knowing that I don't come from the media industry as such, has reached out to me, and he's been a great sounding board, always been open to me contacting him. And I do admire, his philosophy, that radical sharing philosophy, and his openness to collaborate. I'm hopeful.
Hopefully
hopefully it's not people like you and I, and we get super competitive.
Absolutely. Hey, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today, Don. I've really enjoyed the conversation, and like you, we'll be watching to see how this evolves in the coming months.
Thank you. Thanks, Duncan. All the best.
The Fold is brought to you by the Spin-Off Podcast Network, together with Vodafone. It was hosted by Duncan Grieve, produced by T.I. Butler, with production management by Rachel LaRue and series production by Jane Yee. To find out how Vodafone can help you reach your personal and business potential, visit vodafone.co.nz.
That was The Fold, brought to you by our partners at oOh!media, making brands unmissable and public spaces better across Aotearoa. Huge thanks to oOh!media for sponsoring this episode of The Fold and enabling us to make unmissable connections with Kiwis.
Talofa lover, I'm Madeline Chapman, editor at The Spin-Off. If you have the means, consider supporting our high-quality journalism by becoming a Spin-Off member. Sign up now at thespinoff.co.nz/donate.
The Spin-Off Podcast Network.